Hello. For this intense 9-month program, I dedicated a specific focus for each term. In Michaelmas, the emphasis was on reflection and research. This was a term spent on thinking deeply about what are the most urgent or persistent questions that my work should engage with.
Malaysia is a sprawling land divided into two parts.
Like many new countries, Malaysia has a complex relationship with its history. After thousands of years of animist and Hindu influence, the last century's deep embrace of modernism and capitalism has led to an interesting and often contested coexistence between the two opposing cultural forces. This is complicated even further when Islam enjoyed a resurgence in the 1980s. It changed the ethnic identity of the Malaysian Malays significantly, downplaying a great deal of traditional custom in the name of Islam. Pre-Islamic customs came to be seen as backward and something shameful. Despite this, animist influence continues to persist, becoming the third strange bedfellow between religion and capitalism. Despite ritual, dress, and even popular culture adopting an Islamic stance, the insistence for the supernatural is always there, and the obsession and protectiveness for believing in the supernatural remains one of the more obvious legacies of pre-Islamic influence in daily Malay life. It is also very interesting to note how the porous idea of the supernatural often manifests into thinly veiled misogyny that many Malay women themselves internalize. As someone raised by a grandmother and a mother obsessed with the supernatural, the way it has become another presence in my life and how it has affected the performance of the feminine in my life remains a deeply personal and rich question for me. You'll have found it replete in my extended written text. Initially, I thought of these rapid changes in terms of forgetting, and I began looking at archives, looking for clues in the spectral elements of old photography, so elaborated by Susan Sontag and Derrida. As a child, my mother was very protective of family photos, frequently destroying them for fear of black magic or for some shame for her past before Islam became so dominant. Each old image then becomes this sort of personal and intimate encounter, and it is never me looking at a photo as much as something in a photo looking at me and telling me something that could not be said in my daily life. Etching became this lovely way of extracting the spectral in archive photos, of reclaiming them. I love how this strictly European practice is being used by a Southeast Asian to re-look and revive that sense of doubt and curiosity about my past through old images. The process of etching, with its burning and its potions of acid, had these sort of circular parallels to witchcraft that I also really loved.
Est-ce que vous croyez aux fantômes?
In Michaelmas, I also discovered Derrida's concept of spectrality, really another conceptual pun from his idea of trace or difference in his larger theory of deconstruction, but one that spoke of the vengeance of the past. Spectrality is popularly used in a strictly historical sense, but the sensitive reader of Derrida would understand it as a large critique of Western logocentrism. Derrida, being of Jewish heritage, was essentially saying that we are all superstitious, Western or Eastern. This sort of captivated me and gave me a fascinating bridge between my own life experiences and my love for reading Western philosophy. It became a sort of framework for me to understand my family and something I expand in my extended written text.
Je ne sais pas si je crois ou si je ne crois pas aux fantômes, mais je dis vive les fantômes. Et vous, est-ce que vous y croyez aux fantômes?
Oui, certainement.
Hilary term, as much as it was a term to write my extended written text, became a time for making an experimentation and marks the first time I shifted away from 2D work to 3D work and sound art. Writing the text allowed me to confront questions while I made work. What was about a cultural obsession also became a study of familial trauma, about mental illness, and that sense of self-alienation you feel when you're full of doubt between the empirical and the supernatural. The female body as a matrilineal passage became this interesting medium for me to explore these ideas, and I chose sculpture for its age-old link to playing with absence and presence, much like Derrida's own language and philosophy. To start experimenting, I prepared an installation that contributed to a single presence in waiting, a seated figure in a large space that speaks essentially through her skirt, through my own text. There's a performative element where visitors are asked to remove their shoes like any Malay home, as a way of experiencing the familiar project space anew. Sound, scent, and unbitten etching plates engage in a collective dance of absence and presence. Further experimentation followed in sculpture. In my last installation, a participant mentioned she felt someone was in the room, and in truth, I really wanted to know who this person could be, so I began building her, waiting for the process to reveal herself to me. We built an interesting bond in between my reading of Derrida. In making her, she took turns being my mother, my grandmother, and ultimately, in completing it by shrinking its skeletal form through the skirt, I birthed my own self-portrait. The completion of the two sculptures sparred engaging conversations, especially with Brian Kettling and Samson Kambalu, about listening and respecting her, the sculpture. I began an exploration of iteration, playing with creation and recreation as a way of teasing out more languages from the sculpture. I made a series of self-portraits that attempted to understand my lack of self-worth and take it to that polar end of the world of culture and mysticism. I went into the clinical, the anonymous scenes of daily life. I then also played with paint and fabric, committing a durational game of presence and absence by feeling a mannequin I found with the palm of my hands. It resulted in a 20-foot fabric that was a temporary installation that danced in the project space with a fan. My experimentation with sound also continued. Hilary term was spent experimenting with programming sound and light together, and it plays a role in my final installation. We programmed incandescent light to run in time with sound recordings, though I understand the risks involved with its heavy connotation with the theatrical and how the theatrical has an uneasy relationship with contemporary art. And afterwards, I went back to revisit my old found images, my collection of them, and thought about how to start new conversations with them. I tried it out with some text, but felt it was overly modern. I really wanted something that could balance the overall tone of the effective nature of my sculpture. Trinity term became the term where I began to curate as well as create new work. I had a body of works that I was happy with, but I also knew it was a time where I had to aggressively edit, step back from my experiments, and sort of identify where they can be situated and how they may be read. Over the break, I thought of creating something quite dramatic. I wanted to make a locked room installation for my final work. I designed this sort of very theatrical space where people would be confronted with the sculpture for 3 minutes at a time in a dark space. But I soon began to realize that this is more of an anxiety to control the viewer. And I felt that my sculpture needed to breathe more and allow more reading space for the viewer. And I also began to think about my fascination with archives and research and philosophy as a different expression that's in the same conversation with the sculpture. So I researched into artists like Kader Attia and his exploration or strategies when he studies museums. This idea of museums as hegemony, archives as hegemony. I also looked at Huma Baba's work, especially her work at the Metropolitan Rooftop, to look for her strategies to defend, an aesthetic I consider shares some effective elements like mine. Editing and situating has been perhaps the most taxing process in these 9 months. Patrick Flores writes extensively and poetically about the complications of post-colonial Southeast Asian art that way. In his paper, Field Notes from Art Worlds, Flores describes the anxiety for context, something I feel I go through when making work and receiving critique from my work. In it, he writes, "Always in the explication of art worlds that are not of the center and deemed provincial in many respects, there is a demand for, if not a fretfulness over, context, the desire to unburden location, the ground of claim. Without such a context, the specimen is stripped of its artistic grandeur as if context invests it with agency, the wherewithal to stand alone as art, to validate its life before it is admitted into the art world, a contemporary art world that is so taken by the living." Flores is speaking of the circular quandary that no doubt afflicts many Southeast Asian artists who, when engaging with her specific context and past, must balance a double-edged sword. If she references her culture too closely, she risks being exotic or worse, accused of self-exoticizing. If she doesn't, she also risks being completely unrecognizable or detached from her questions. Here Flores hints at a contemporary art world that is, in its commitment to a cosmopolitanism, creates a paradoxical hegemony that simplifies the complex truth of what it means to truly include voices from around the world. And 2003, Thai curator Apinan Poshiananda celebrated the opening of Thailand's first entrance into the Venice Biennale by offering visitors Thai food and Thai massages. In his press release titled Reverie and Phantasm in the Epoch of Global Trauma, he explained the deliberate gesture thus. Conscious of the paradigm for intercultural encounter, the idea of constructing imagined space and viewers' dictatorship relates to exporting Thai exotica. Bacchanalian revelry by Thai artists and performers bring the message of merriment as well as trauma. Despite their exotic displays, painting, video, carpentry, cookery, therapy, massage, and dance, they become messengers and victims of a global trap that causes detriment and destruction. Their endeavor to build the Thai pavilion and collaborate in teamwork to be reciprocal with the viewers' comment on the hierarchy of art internationalism and system of new art world order. As a Southeast Asian, and as a new artist, I take a great deal of comfort from this gesture and from this statement, as I can only exist as I am, making the work that I make. My existence and my art's existence is essentially and constantly a political act. I want it to be understood that I am vigilant of these dynamics. I live with it acutely as I make work and when I stand beside it. For my final install, a great deal has been stripped down from all my explorations. The installation stands as a strict encapsulation of my fascinations and attempt to grapple them. In the space, you will find references to the different manifestations of the spectral question and my sincere and intimate endeavors to find solace in art. Thank you for your time.